Okay, so let's take a deep dive into Act 4, Scene 1 of The Merchant of Venice. Now, don't forget, you look at the merchant sample answers that I've given you already, and this scene has been referred to in numerous sample answers. I think you already have enough on it, but there seems to be demand for me to go through um, the scene line by line. So that's what I'm going to do in this short, well, it won't be that short video. Hopefully, it won't be more than 20 minutes, and hopefully, you will find it useful. So this is, of course, the trial or court scene, and it is the dramatic climax of the play. It is the scene in which the plot lines come together, and essentially we find out the fate of our main characters. It is a scene in which Portia's role is heroic, and it's a scene in which we see how Shylock's um, intense and passionate desire for revenge blinds him to logic and to the trap that's been set for him. So it is incredibly dramatic. Now, don't forget, the junior cycle, you're going to have to write like a maximum 4 or 5 paragraphs in The Merchant of Venice. And on this particular scene, maybe you're going to write 2 or 3 paragraphs. So you don't have to know it in the kind of. I love the play. I think it's a great play. I'm going to enjoy going through this now. But don't forget, don't feel under pressure. You don't have to know the play in the you know meticulous detail that you might need to know it for leaving certificate if you were studying the Shakespeare play. And even then, I think students overestimate the depth and the knowledge, the depth of the knowledge that they have to accumulate. So I'm going to show you a few things before we get going. First of all, um, I think that the play is a very interesting exploration of the reality of prejudice. And what I did just before, sorry, um, I began this like recording, just had a look through the scene. It's a longish scene. I highlight a few things. So let's go. I just want to show you this, right? So there's one, two, and again, I've made a video on this before, but apparently more is needed. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times, and there are more times, but 7 times in the first couple of hundred words of this scene, in which Shylock is referred to not as a man, but as the Jew. And the reason for that is because, in the cultural context of the play, in other words, in order to understand what happens in the play, we need to understand the world that the characters inhabit. To be Jewish is to be less than. To be Jewish is to be inferior, to be suspect, to be alien. And people like Shylock have been had that message delivered to them throughout their whole life. That's why those monologues and speeches that he delivers earlier in the play, hath the Jew not eyes, and you spit upon my Jewish gabardine. They are such powerful speeches. So I think in order to understand Shylock's um, behavior in this scene, you have to understand that context. And of course, he did say it himself, didn't he? Cursed be my, like he would curse his tribe if he ever forgave Antonio, because he feels Antonio is a symbol of that prejudice and that bigotry and that unfairness and that injustice that has been his life and has been the life of his people and will continue to be the life of his people. So when he gets this opportunity to, give one back to Antonio and symbolically to the Christians who dominate and um, um, discriminate against him. That's why he's so excited to take the opportunity. So, look, it begins with the Duke, and he's speaking to Antonio. I'm going to highlight and go through kind of highlighted parts. And he says to Antonio, "Thou art come to answer a stony adversary, an inhuman wretch, incapable of pity, void and empty from any dram of mercy." And that's a description of Shylock. And it shows how Shylock is regarded by the Duke. I love the idea of Shylock being a stony adversary, tough, strong, but also the idea that he has no heart, he has no humanity, that he doesn't feel. And there's no sense from the Duke that maybe Shylock does feel, and that his behaviour is a result of his feelings of, injustice. But he's described as inhuman, incapable of pity, void and empty from any dram of mercy. It's a great quote. He tells Antonio that he has to be tried because of the law. And Antonio's response is interesting. "I have heard your grace has taken great pains to qualify his rigorous course." So in other words, the Duke has tried to dissuade Shylock from pursuing the case. "But since he stands obdurate, that means stubborn, and that no lawful means can carry me out of his envy's reach, I do oppose my patience to his fury, and am armed to suffer with a quietness of spirit the very tyranny and rage of his." So Antonio's putting himself forward as, a noble victim here. His nobility means that he will not squeal and cry and beg. He has reached a point where he's accepting his fate. He's showing dignity. Now again, this is something that we must accept in Antonio's character, and it is admirable. But it must also be balanced against the fact that this is the man who spat upon Shylock and called him, a cutthroat dog and a cur. So, like Shylock, if you're going to say Shylock is a man of contradictions, he's a complicated character, so is Antonio. But here, he's noble. The Duke calls for Shylock to be brought to the court. Shylock is brought in, and the Duke again implores Shylock to back off. He says, glancing an eye of pity on his losses that have of late so huddled on his back, enough to impress a royal merchant down, and pluck commiseration of his state from brassy bosoms and rough hearts of flint, from stubborn Turks and Tartars never trained to offices of tender courtesy, we all expect a gentle answer, Jew. So when he says we all expect a gentle answer, he's saying, you need to back off. The Duke is the most powerful man in the state. He's saying, Antonio is a good guy. He's lost his money. He's had misfortune. You need to be nice to him. You need to back off him. So Shylock is faced with the antipathy and the anger and the looming threat of the entire state. But his response is unflinching. I have possessed your grace of what I purpose, and by our holy Sabbath have I sworn to have the due and forfeit of my bond. If you deny it, let the danger light upon your charter and your city's freedom. And again, that's a really, really good quote. See that there? Shylock is a highly intelligent man. His intelligence shines through there. The Duke might be sympathetic towards Antonio. The Duke might want Antonio to be released from his bond. But the Duke cannot compel Shylock, because if he does, he will ruin the reputation of Venice as a place of law, a place where contracts, once signed, are binding. And if Venice loses its reputation as a place of law where contracts are binding, well, then Venice loses its trade. Venice exists as a trading state. It relies entirely on its reputation as a place where business is done in a legal way which can be relied upon. Shylock is saying, if you force me, if you deny me my bond, then I can ruin your business. So he's very, very, very intelligent. In other words, while the Duke has power, Shylock also has power, and Shylock's power lies in his intelligence. The tension builds. And when Shylock is explaining his determination, he says, I can give no reason, nor I will not, more than a lodged hate and a certain loathing I bear Antonio. Now we're thinking about quotes to learn. I think the stony adversary, an inhuman wretch, incapable of pity, void and empty from any dram of mercy, is a great one to do. I think this quote here is a great quote to learn if you're looking at this key scene to explain how the tension builds and the insights we get into Shylock's character. And of course, I think that is a wonderful quote as well. And I'm going to mark loads of quotes here, and you can choose which ones you want to learn. You don't have to learn many of them. But look at his strength there. Look at the contempt he has for the Duke and for Antonio and for those who are trying to compel him. Look at the sense of defiance in his words. I'm not going to explain myself to you. I'm just going to tell you I hate this guy and I want him sorted. Now, Shylock has already, in the most eloquent and articulate language earlier in the play, voiced his experience of prejudice and voiced the trauma that he has experienced. But he's not going to go through that now. The time has come for him to take some measure of revenge. And he's not going to play the game of the Duke. He's not going to he's not going to be swayed. When when Bassanio then, tries to intervene on Shylock's behalf, there's an interesting interaction. Bassanio says, Shylock says, I'm not bound to please thee with my answers. Oh, sorry, I'll just begin the little interaction. Bassanio says, this is no answer, thou unfeeling man, to excuse the current of thy cruelty. Shylock says, I'm not bound to please thee with my answers. I don't care about you. Bassanio, do all men kill the things they do not love? Shylock, hates any man the thing he would not kill? Bassanio, every offence is not a hate at first. And Shylock says, what, wouldst thou have a serpent sting thee twice? And again, I think it's a brilliant example of Shakespeare's use of imagery. And again, it shows the logic of Shylock's approach here. The reference to the serpent, if you want to use big words, is a biblical allusion. A reference to, the serpent as being a symbol of the devil and of corruption, which is it's an allusion to the Genesis and the fall and Adam and Eve and the serpent being the emblematic of evil and the devil. So when he looks at Antonio, he says, I see evil, and that he's already stung me, and I have an opportunity now to crush him. What would you do if there was a snake about to strike you for the second time? What would you do? So it's a beautiful use of imagery by Shakespeare, and again, it deepens our understanding of Shylock's character. Antonio goes on and gives a noble speech. His bigotry evident in that speech, referring to his Jewish heart and, let me have judgment and the Jew his will, talking about Shylock as if he's not a human being. And then this wonderful moment again, fantastic and very, very clever. Shylock says, look, enough of this shit. I don't care. If every ducat in 6,000 ducats were in 6 parts and every part of ducat I would not draw them, I would have my bond. Now, I know you're not going to learn all of that. I'd love you to. I love the flow of those words. Shakespeare's such a master of our language. The meter in those lines is beautiful. But look, if you just learned that, again, he's insistent. You can offer me all the money you want. You can offer to pay me the money I'm owed 10, 20, 30 times over. I don't care. I don't want it. I want my bond. In other words, I want my pound of flesh. So the tension builds as it seems that Shylock is implacable. Implacable meaning will not move, stubborn, cannot be convinced, cannot be swayed. He says, what judgment shall I dread doing no wrong? You have among you many a purchased slave, which like your asses and your dogs and mules, you use in abject and in slavish parts because you bought them. Shall I say to you, let them be free, marry them to your heirs? Why sweat they under burdens? Let their beds be made as soft as yours, and let their palates be seasoned with such viands. You will answer, the slaves are ours. So do I answer you. The pound of flesh which I demand of him is dearly bought. 'Tis mine, and I will have it. If you deny me, fie upon your law. There is no force in the decree of Venice. I stand for judgment. Answer, shall I have it? His intelligence is amazing. He's pointing out the hypocrisy. He sees the Venetians, the Christians, as hypocrites. They own slaves. They mistreat those slaves. They don't, those slaves are not equal. And Shylock is saying to them, if I tell you have to treat them equally, you're going to say, no, I don't. The law says that they're slaves. And he's saying, well, if the law says that they're slaves, the law also says that I'm entitled to my pound of flesh. So enough of this. Strong, intelligent, educated, learned, determined, a villain? I don't, I know some of your teachers will teach you that he's a villain. I don't see it. I get him. I understand him. He is a man who has experienced incredible suffering and prejudice, but he's now going to take his time and determinedly seek out revenge. Then, of course, we have this, interesting interaction where Portia, the idea of Portia coming in disguised, the idea of people being, like women being dressed as men and men being dressed as women is something that you see in lots of Shakespeare plays. The Duke says, upon my power I may dismiss this court unless Bellario, a learned doctor, whom I have sent for to determine this, come here today. By the way, when it says doctor, it means doctor of law, somebody with a PhD. Celerio, my lord, here stays without a messenger the letters from the doctor new come from Padua. Bring us the letters, call the messenger. Bassanio, good cheer, Antonio. What man courage yet? The Jew shall have my flesh. There's another one. Look, the Jew. Blood, bones, and all, before thou dost lose for me one drop of blood. So Bassanio he's been a good friend. He's supporting Antonio. Antonio says, I'm not afraid. And at that point, Nerissa comes in, disguised as a lawyer's clerk. The Duke says, did you come from Padua, from Bellario? Nerissa, as Clark says, from both, my lord. Bellario greets your grace. She hands him a paper, which he reads, while Shylock sharpens his knife on the sole of a shoe. I love that stage instruction. People have often asked me, how could he sharpen his knife on the sole of a shoe? Well, the shoes would often be hobnailed. There'd be metal pins in the shoe. And Bassanio says to Shylock, why dost thou whet thy knife so earnestly? To whet your knife is to sharpen it. And Shylock says, to cut the forfeiture from the bank route there. I was confused out with bankrupt. So he's absolutely brazen. Why are you sharpening your knife? Because I'm going to use it to slice the pound of flesh from your man over there. Gratiano, again, look at the language. Not on thy soul, but on thy soul, a little play on words. Harsh Jew, thou makes thy knife keen, but no metal can, not the hangman's axe bear half the keenness of thy sharp envy. Can no prayers pierce thee? Shylock, no, none that you have wit enough to make. There's nothing you can say to me to change my mind. That interchange goes on. And the Duke then, having read the letter, says, this letter from Bellario does commend a young and learned doctor to our court. Where is he? Nerissa, as clerk, he attended here hard by to know your answer whether you'll admit him. Well, we know, through dramatic irony, that this person, this supposed male law student, is in fact Portia in disguise. We know that. Dramatic irony, of course, is when we know something and the characters in the play don't know, and that creates tension and anticipation. With all my heart, some 3 or 4 of you go give him courteous conduct to the place. The attendants leave. Meantime, the court shall hear Bellario's letter, and then the letter is read. And it says this: Your grace shall understand that at the receipt of your letter I am very sick, but in this instant that your messenger come in loving visitation, was with me a young doctor of Rome. His name is Balthazar. I acquainted him with the cause in controversy between the Jew, not Shylock, the Jew, and Antonio the merchant. We turned over many books together. He is furnished with my opinion, which bettered with his own learning, the greatness whereof I cannot enough commend, comes with him with the opportunity to fill up your grace's request in my stead. I beseech you, let his lack of years be no impediment to him, to let him lack a reverend estimation, for I never knew so young a lady with so old a head, so young a body, little slip of the tongue there, with so old a head. I leave him to your gracious acceptance, whose trial shall better publish his commendation. So this is the letter that's supposed to come from Bellario, and it's saying, oh, this young fella, he's no beard. Now he's very young. He's no beard. Of course, there's no beard because it's a woman. But like I believe me, now this guy, should listen to him. And of course, Balthazar, that's Portia. I often get confused between Bellario and Balthazar. So anyway, enter Portia as Balthazar, and again, the tension ratchets up because we're anticipating what she's going to do. Again, quickly, Portia using the same language, demonstrating the attitude to Shylock. I am informed thoroughly of the case, which is the merchant here and which the Jew. So she's introduced. She, as Balthazar says, the Jew must be merciful. Shylock says, on what compulsion? Tell me that. And of course, Portia says very famously, sorry, no, 1 second. The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It's amazing how many students learn that quote and don't know what it means. Like, do you know what that quote means? And because if you're going to learn it, you can't learn. What's the point of learning the quote if you don't know what it means? Because you can't understand it. If you can't understand it, then you can't use it in an answer. When she says strained, it's a shortening of the word restrained. And in that sense, it means limited. And when she says the quality of mercy is not strained, and then she compares it to rain dropping from heaven, if rain drops from heaven, it doesn't drop in one drop. It drops in, a torrent. What she's saying is that, mercy is unlimited. In other words, no matter what the offense caused, you can find mercy. It is possible to forgive anything. That's what she's saying. It's a wonderfully, catchy line. But it means nothing to Shylock. She hasn't lived his life. She hasn't experienced what he's experienced. It seems very, I was going to use the word ethereal. Which means theoretical and not practical, dreamlike. Wouldn't it be great if the world was like that? And of course, for Shylock, the world isn't like that at all. Nobody showed him mercy. If he was forfeiting a bond and he was before the court, nobody's going to be arguing that he shouldn't have to be punished. He understands the hypocrisy of these people. He understands the imbalance of power. So Portia's words, they ring hollow to him. She goes on and gives this really big and long and quite boring speech. Shylock just responds with, I crave the law, the penalty and forfeit of my bond. And what he doesn't realise is that she's kind of laying the groundwork for the trap that he'll walk into. She says, why then thus it is you must prepare your bosom for his knife. She tells Antonio, look, there's nothing we can do. I can't persuade him not to do it. I know the law. He's right. The law is on his side. And Shylock says, oh, noble judge, oh, excellent young man. he's delighted because he thinks he's right at that moment. This is the most tense moment in the whole play. Antonio was told by Portia, lay bare your bosom. In other words, open your shirt because he's going to take that pound of flesh. And of course, take a pound of flesh, you're going to kill him. And it's at that moment that the trap is sprung. And Portia says, she asks him, have you got the balance here to weigh the flesh? In other words, the scales. It's a pound of flesh. Shylock is prepared. I have them ready. Portia says, have by some surgeon Shylock on your charge to stop his wounds, lest he do bleed to death. Shylock says, is it so nominated in the bond? She asks, have you got a doctor here? So, like, if when he starts to bleed, that you have the, to stanch the blood so he doesn't die. And Shylock says, well, there's no requirement on me to do that. In other words, his whole intention is that Antonio will die as a result of this wound. And then we have that interchange that results in, the trap. Antonio feels that Bassanio desperately tries to intervene, not realizing that Balthazar is his wife. And he says, I am married to a wife which is as dear to me as life itself. But life itself, my wife, and all the world are not with me esteemed above my life, above thy life. I would lose all, sacrifice them all, here to this devil to deliver you. So again, if you're talking about friendship, there's a really beautiful friendship between Antonio and Bassanio. It's established from the very first scene in the play. I've already been through that. And there you have like Bassanio like feeling really awful because, his this is his fault. He was the one who went and borrowed the money to marry Portia that got Antonio in debt, that resulted in this disaster. So he's desperate to save his friend. Portia's laughing a little bit because she's saying, well, I'm your wife. Would you give me up for your friend? Anyway, let's get to the crux of the scene. Shylock says, these be Christian husbands. I have a daughter. Would any of the stock of Barabbas have been her husband rather than a Christian? We trifle time, I pray thee, pursue sentence. And of course, he's referring there to the subplot to do with Jessica, his daughter. And again, what was done to Shylock was humiliating. The fact that Jessica ran off and married a Christian and took his money and, spent his money. He sees that as being humiliating for him. And again, in the context of the time, it was humiliating because daughters were seen as their father's property. And, for her to do what she did is hugely offensive. And he says she could have married any Jew. The tribe of Barabbas is Jewish people. She could have married any Jew. But no, she went and married a Christian. So again, this underlines the reason why he's like salivating here, anticipating this moment of victory. It's not really about Antonio. Antonio merely personifies all of the cruelty that he's experienced in his life. And of course, then Portia pulls out. I think this is number 7. I'm not going to flick back. You've learned this quote if you're studying The Merchant of Venice. She pulls out the clause from the contract, which brings everything, turns everything around, changes the course of the play. Big plot twist here. Very exciting. If you're writing that answer, why should somebody read The Merchant of Venice? You're making a talk to your class. You're doing a podcast about a play or a novel that you've read and you think young people should read or go to see. And then you can talk about, there's an amazing plot twist at the end. And if thou dost shed one drop of Christian blood, thy lands and goods, and by the laws of Venice confiscate unto the state of Venice. Right? So she tells him, there's no blood in the contract. So you can take your pound of flesh, off you go. One drop of blood, you lose everything. So it's, to use a phrase that was invented later on by Joseph Heller, for Shylock, it's a catch-22 situation. For Shylock, he can't, he wants that pound of flesh. He wants to destroy Antonio. But if he destroys Antonio, he destroys himself. And her intelligence has walked him into the trap. And now he's done. So that's the moment of climax in the play. He desperately tries to scramble back. I take this offer then, pay the bond thrice and let the Christian go. Right, fair enough, I'll take me money. And of course, he's told no. The Jew shall have all justice. Soft, no hasty shall have nothing but the penalty. So she's driving it home. Oh, Jew, an upright judge, a learned judge. See, I find this, unpleasant, but it's Shakespeare reflecting um, the world as it was. The world as it was. Gratiano, is you know celebrating. He's a horrible, horrible character, Gratiano. A second Daniel, a Daniel Jew, now infidel. I have you on the hip. I have you on the hip means now you're vulnerable. On the hip, it was a reference to sword play, like battle. You crack somebody on the hip with your sword, which causes them to collapse. And then once they're down on the ground, that's when you can deliver the coup de grace and destroy them. So and the Daniel reference is another reference to the Bible, Daniel in the lion's den. This is celebrating Balthazar. We know it's Portia, showing bravery beyond bravery, winning through wit and intelligence as opposed to physical strength. And Antonio is released from the bond. And as you know, Shylock is undone. Portia shows no mercy. If it be proved against an alien that by direct or indirect attempts he seek the life of any citizen, the party against which he does contrive shall seize one half of his goods, the other half comes to the privy coffer of the state. So she's really driving her victory home there. She's now saying that Shylock knew that this would result in suffering for Antonio. Antonio is a citizen of the state. Shylock, even though he's probably born and reared in Venice, is regarded as an alien because of his religion. And the punishment for an alien plotting against a Christian citizen is to be bankrupted, to lose everything, to have half of his value of his estate given to the victim, i.e. Antonio. So happy days, happy ending for Antonio. Hooray! Antonio gets all the money, so he's no longer bankrupt and he's no longer under threat of losing his life. And the state of Venice gets the other half of Shylock's estate. And Shylock is broken. And as you know, he is forced then to take the Christian faith. The Duke, I pardon thee thy life before thou ask it, for half thy wealth it is Antonio's, the other half comes to the general estate, which humbleness may drive unto a fine. Shylock says, take my life and all, you take my house when you do take the prop that doth sustain my house, you take my life when you do take the means whereby I live. And Antonio says, look, let's show him some mercy. So please, my lord, the Duke and all the court to quit the fine for one half of his goods. I am content. So he will let me have the other half in use to render it upon his death unto the gentleman that lately stole his daughter. Two things provided more, that for his favour he presently become a Christian, the other that he do record a gift here unto this court of all he dies possessed unto his son Lorenzo and his daughter. So Antonio's like showing mercy, because what a nice guy he is. And he says that Shylock has to become a Christian in order to survive and to give half of his money, not to Antonio, but to Lorenzo and to Jessica, which of course is a dagger to his heart. And that's an explanation of Act 4, Scene 1, the trial scene, with some of the key quotes that I would learn highlighted. I hope you found that useful.